All right, Psalm 142. Let's call this one In Summary, I Cry Out, in yet another seemingly bookend psalm where David is going to begin by saying, I cry out, and towards the end, he is going to again say, I cry out in the beginning. He's going to talk about going beyond crying out to the Lord to say that I plead with the Lord, I pour out my complaint to the Lord, and I tell my trouble before him, as he is going to go on to say, something that helps us understand his condition, as in verse 3, he will say, when my spirit is faint within me, when I am walking along a path in which the enemy has set a trap for me, and going back to that theme of isolation, when no one sees, when there is no refuge, and when no one cares. He's going to lead back into that thought of, I cry out to you, my refuge, when he acknowledges who can be his refuge, even when he has no refuge in any one person. He's going to make that the basis for his prayer in this psalm, that God attend to him, that he deliver him, and he bring him out of what he's going to call here prison, as he is going to, in sum, give us another recurring theme, and that is, even in the midst of his uncertainty, David finds reason for confidence when he says in verse 7 toward the end, the righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. An interesting contrast to that portion of the psalm where he dedicates his attention to his circumstance. It may sound like self-pity, but sometimes it ain't necessarily self-pity if it's just flat out true. As the psalm is attributed to his time in the cave, he says no one sees, he has no refuge, and no one cares. The irony of the historical context being that during this time in the cave, God actually did assemble to David a number of people who likewise had their own source of woe, and quite possibly connected to David through their common sense of struggle. But in summary, the themes that this psalm reminded me of go back to the beginning of the Psalms when we entitled this entire study, in some ways, One Way, going back to that story that we saw from The Wire, an old show that talked about the way in which a community in Baltimore had been taken over by violence. And one particular gang leader was super young and in going into a particular convenience store guarded by an older security guard. He gave that security guard a very rough wake-up call to the realities of that neighborhood when he simply told that security guard, after that young man stole something in plain sight, one way. And the security guard was like, what do you mean? And he said, you want things to be one way when they are really another. And so as much as that security guard simply wanted to be able to have integrity in doing his job, not having to turn a blind eye to crimes committed obviously in his presence, that young man was reminding him that that neighborhood worked a very different way than the way that the security guard wanted it to run, even if he simply wanted it to run with integrity. On the other hand, there are times when we want things to come to us or blessings to come to us one way, when God is saying that they actually have to come through a more difficult path that actually does involve a higher level of sacrifice and sometimes integrity than we are willing to take up. Accordingly, one of the final summary themes that this psalm seemed to remind me of is the way in which I would like my way to go, down a path that's free of traps, snares, dangers, or fears. However, much like Psalm 23 says, he will lead me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. He does not promise that those paths of righteousness will be free of dangers. And so there are some times when God is leading me to a healthy place by frightening pathways. And even though I might want to go one way, a path that seems safe, God is saying the path to truly finding fulfillment goes down the scary path. But it's a path that I am fully capable of walking if I can let go of my need to negotiate it under my own wisdom and power, and understand that I am going to need to do the second thing David acknowledges here, and that is, if I can make God my refuge, then his wisdom can get me down paths that are honestly beyond my own ability to figure out. And even more, that whole concept of refuge really struck me this time because of the degree to which David talks about his isolation And so beyond the ways that taking refuge in God can give us the wisdom to effectively walk paths that we might stumble down or even just fail on our own, it seems to say that if I can avoid the temptation to take refuge in bad or just inappropriate company, there is a time when God will replace my isolation with healthy company if I can just wait, like David was able to wait in the cave, pouring out his complaint to God, not pretending that he didn't feel the weight of the isolation, but after being candid and crying out to God about his desperation and his sense of isolation, it was only a matter of time before God replaced the available company with company that was objectively righteous, understanding that all our ways seem right in our own eyes, but objectively righteous means it's company that's actually doing the things that God has said it's right to do.